stand still today, but we thank you for people who are here. We have a great treat this morning with Doug Pagitt from Minnesota and pastor, activist, soon to be a politician.
Hope so.
President.
Yes.
I'm
the highest office in the land.
Yes.
Go for it.
And Suzii Paynter from Atlanta Cooperative Baptist Fellowship,
Denominate work.
And it's an amazing structure. If I knew about that, I would have signed up. So, without further ado, I would like us to start because they have so much going on. And Jeff Liu is a recent PhD.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Theology and culture from Fuller Theological Seminary. And he used to be a pastor associate pastor at Lake Avenue Church, and now he is interfaith chaplain at Pomona College Consortium.
Wow.
And he's one of the best moderators among Asian Americans, so I'm his fan.
Awesome.
So you
Glory
are
to
in for
God.
a treat this morning, so let's give a big hand.
Woo!
All right, this is a very volatile issue after November faithful election. And I didn't want people of color addressing this issue, knowing that 81% white evangelical voted somebody in. So here we go. Do we retrieve or retract evangelical Christianity? Jeff, you're on.
Okay, great. Welcome, everybody. It's good to be with you. And I would love, in order to answer that question, I'd love for each of you to tell us a little bit about the organizations that you're involved with. Help us understand how you're already positioned within this question and what makes you, what makes you more inclined to retrieve or retract, or less inclined to retrieve or retract, or what makes it complicated. So tell us a little bit about the organizations you work with and how that postures you within this question.
Yeah. You sure? Okay. All right. So I'm Doug Pagitt. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I currently pastor a church. Not denominational. We're not related to a denomination. We don't even organize or think of ourselves in relationship to denominations. So I guess we're non-denominational, but more deeply than that. We don't use it as the reference point. And that's true for a lot of non-denominational, free church tradition, local congregations, that kind of thing. So that's the setting that I'm currently in. I started that church, as people in the tradition that I'm in tend to do, right? A couple of friends get together and say, we should have a church. And then you just start a church, and off and running you are. Part of the reason that I'm in that way and operating in that kind of space is that I was brought into Christianity as a teenager in 1983. And I didn't have any religious experience at all. And it was people from a campus ministry called Campus Crusade for Christ that I had my first organized experience with religion. I had my own kind of spiritual awakening, and they captured up my life. And that group, parachurch organizations in the 1980s and from the 1970s, that was what they were sort of all about, was kind of finding the most generic expression of what it would mean to be Christian. They didn't mind what denomination you were from. In fact, they were trying to be para-denominational by being para-church. Outside and above the church, didn't want to mess with the denominational system. That was a big movement for a long time. It happened in Catholicism early on with Vatican II, where it started to open up communion for Catholics. And there's a big movement from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s for people to not see themselves in such deep denominational groups. So I was brought into sort of the generic evangelical grouping of people. And I've appreciated that very deeply. I feel a bit like I'm part of all the traditions without being too much in any one of them in that space. So evangelicals as a subset of the American religious experience is the group that I come from. I was trained in a seminary that was connected to evangelicalism, Bethel Theological Seminary in St. Paul. That's kind of the tribe, the sort of cross-denominational evangelicals are the people that I thought about Christianity with in my early days. And so I would identify myself very firmly, both by that religious tradition and background and heritage, but also by some of the classic kind of definitions of what it means to be an evangelical. I think the story of Jesus is really good news for people. I'm personally animated by it. My spirituality, I like to say, is following God in the way of Jesus. So it's a Jesus-centric spirituality. I treat the Bible as a very important community member in the tradition and the community that I'm a part of, both the global community, the local community, and the historic community. That's really meaningful. I think that personal experience with God on a daily and regular basis is a thing that happens. And I had a conversion experience. But I could try to say, and I have tried to say over the years, I'm post-evangelical. I'm not, but I'll tell you, you know what nobody else cares about is any of the special flavors you put into your evangelical sauce, right? When I'm around people from denominational backgrounds or people that are not, it is a social category that I find myself in. Now, I would also root myself in the fact that in the evangelical ecosystem, I think it's really complicated. There's a lot of variety of it. There's evangelicals that are denominational, and I'm from the non-denominational evangelical side. There are evangelicals that are really conservative. There are evangelicals that are really progressive on social issues and theological issues. There are evangelicals that are really rooted in dogma, and there are evangelicals that are really rooted in freedom. It is a vast landscape of people that I think represent that. And part of the work I'm trying to do in the world, appreciate this conversation, Suzii, the work that you do, and Jeff, this conversation so much, is it seems to me that evangelicals that are conservative have tended to become the most recognizable expression of it. And my friend Jen Butler, who runs an organization called Faith in Public Life group in Washington, D.C., puts it this way. She says, I think there was a right-wing takeover of evangelicalism, and evangelicals have to decide if they're going to be comfortable with that political right-wing takeover of evangelicalism. And I'm not, so we're trying to figure out how to express evangelicalism in a much more broad and inclusive way. And not because I think evangelicalism is the point. I actually don't think it is at all. I just think we can't avoid social construct, and you're going to be called something on this planet, and I don't know how to get away from it. So anyway, that's where I locate myself.
Okay, let me follow up on, we were laughing just a minute earlier about the politician thing. I just want to make doubly sure, are you running for office?
Yeah, yes, I've run for office before.
Okay.
And didn't even get the nomination. So I like to say I'm like Hillary Clinton in 2008. I didn't get the nomination. But I've decided I'm going to run for president. And so I'm probably going to end up like Hillary Clinton in 2016 as well. I'm not sure I'm going to win. And that's heartbreaking to me that she didn't win. But I take civic life and faith both very seriously. And I come from the advocacy side of that conversation. So I'm super interested. I think people should get to run for president if they want to.
Yeah.
We shouldn't act like that's some super elite.
Why not?
It's my way of deconstructing the super elites in the political system. So yeah.
Dr. Suzii Paynter, Executive Coordinator of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. Tell us about CBF. Tell us about your positioning in this question of evangelicalism.
Well, I just want to thank Doug for a great introduction because it's a great segue to talk about CBF. We are a denominational network positioned generally in that same evangelical space in a social construct. But in Baptist life, 25 years ago, there was a split similar to what Jim Butler refers to. And the Southern Baptist Convention was the predominant denomination, and it housed a very big tent. But 25 years ago, CBF broke away from that primarily over issues of scriptural interpretation, women in ministry, and other aspects of church life that begged for what we call free and faithful Baptist expression. And so this free and faithful Baptist expression that we've been living for the past 25 years, we've sought to take the best parts of a denominational history, but pair them with a 21st century network model of association and of church freedom, and understanding that the truly and eternal aspects of Christian witness happen locally in a single person's life, in congregational life, and that the constructs that we use to organize ourselves, like denominations or networks, are themselves temporal, not the eternal part of our faith. And so to keep Jesus at the center, sort of a Jesus worldview, among our congregations and in our mission expressions, but working together right now, CBF has had quite a global presence. We're in 30 countries around the world, working in partnership with more than 121 Baptist unions around the world. We work in partnership not to start churches of our own, but to support and sustain the work of God where we find it already happening globally, to learn from many cultures and to nurture our group of churches, keeping our own delight and joy and vitality in the gospel at the center of our churches. Congregations that like each other, that like the neighborhood they're in, that praise God and praise just the way in which we as a community can do and be more together and more Christ-like in our strength. My own background is also coming out of a very denominational background. I was for many years on the staff of the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which is a large network of churches, a large convention of churches, traditional Baptist convention of churches, 5,300 churches. But there, our expression, especially on faith and justice issues, our commitment to ethics, and being active in the public square, I was their lobbyist and worked on 12 issue areas, everything from prison reform and criminal justice representation, to foster care, to environmental issues, to church-state issues. And so working actively out of the history of evangelicalism that also has a heart for social justice and the breaking of our own self-interest for the greater good and the benefit of many others. And I feel like in some quarters, that big-heartedness of evangelicalism, we've lost that public face of the big heart of Christian love for the world and gotten very narrow. So I would say the evangelistic, the gospel, the good news is all core to, but I'd say it's the jellicle part. I just as soon leave behind some of these more narrow constructs and reframe and look to the future for a robust and vital church and personal faith.
Great, thanks. You've both given us kind of the 30,000-foot view of how you might posture yourselves or describe your organizations. I know both of you as storytellers because I've been watching all of your YouTube content. Lots of stories in there. I'm wondering if you can help us out, giving us a more gritty feel for what happens when someone pushes you on, your alignment. Are you going to retrieve or are you going to retract? Like maybe someone's done this in your congregation, Doug, or in someone in the network, a church leader. How has that come to a head or become a real practical issue for both of you?
I think certainly with 1,800 churches, there's always somebody with another idea. And I think a part of negotiating a community is understanding the things that we share in common. What are the first things? And what are the second things and the third things and the fourth things? What's worthy of really that defining moment of conflict or how to respond to it? I think one of the issues for us in working together as congregations is to go back to our tenets of Baptist distinctives, which is the priesthood of the believer, the autonomy of the local congregation, the separation of church and state, for the benefit of both the church and the state. And to be active in love first. The generous nature of a congregation to accept, believe, retrieve, reconcile. You know, in a congregation that's a living congregation, there is so much grace and so much vitality and so much renewal happening in individual people's lives. So then how do we, as an organization, reflect that? It's so tempting as an organization to get hidebound by these rules and structures, but to instead look back to the local congregations. So first of all, we're imperfect. Let's just start with that. We're temporal. And so let's keep our eye on the most important things. I think in conversation and dialogue, right now our Denama Network is involved in a large conversation with our whole Denama Network. And we've employed a structured process for interviews with hundreds of people, asking people to bring forward artifacts that represent their faith, so sort of an artistic expression of their faith, as well as their opinions on things. And so I think in the actual growth of a community of churches, how do you structure real conversations, real dialogues, and represent that to people, rather than just saying, well, we're going to use Robert's Rules of Order and call a vote. You know, I mean, there's just, these tools are just outdated for the real vitality of the community. And so I think a part of our calling and a part of the energy that we have right now are new tools, new ways of convening ourselves, how to look at ourselves as a giant ecosystem. What's being born? What's dying? What's left over? Who has a great idea? How do we multiply it? How do we take it to the next stage? So let's look at our whole community that way. When you ask those questions, instead of who wins and who loses, or we're going to have a vote here, or, you know, I mean, it's just a different conversation.
Suzii, I have to confess, I have a weird fetish for Robert's Rules of Order.
Oh.
So I'm dismayed to hear that they're outdated. But I get you. Doug, how about you?
Yeah, that's a great way to phrase it. I also think there's a lot of pressure on people trying to decide who's in and who's out. You know, most of us, we have very limited experience with religion. Even if we think we're pretty broad, most of us, it's just part of it's the gift of being a human being in one space, in one place, with one set of experiences that are yours, that aren't everyone else's. So most of us, we don't know every religious tenet and experience that others have had. But we also, as human beings, tend to form these sets of assumptions about what it means to be Christian. And so that's a dominant question in society right now, especially in a pluralistic society, in a religiously changing society, is what makes someone Christian or evangelical? And people have a lot of different views about this. I come from the background that says God's not picky about that. God doesn't care about our religious categories. But a lot of other people really do care, and they think that God cares, and they're pretty convinced that God cares. So it would matter to someone if they would say, look, I'm not a Christian anymore. Now, if you were evangelical in your upbringing and you decide to not be Christian anymore, you've also given up evangelicalism. And a lot of my friends have done that. I don't just mean friends in my church and people kind of hanging around. I mean like pastor friends. They're like, I am out. Like this. There was a set of promises inside of Christianity presented to me in the evangelical construct. Those promises have all come up flat. I'm tapping out. And that's happening across our society at a very, very high level. Some people then are trying to figure out, what do I do about my spirituality if I've tapped out of Christianity? Right? They just don't want to fight it anymore. And that's a super interesting conversation. So a lot of that has hinged on particular social issues. For a lot of people, they've said, look, if gay people can't be involved, if there's some litmus test around someone's attraction to other people and how they express their love inside of relationships, I'm out. And they believe very wholeheartedly that you cannot be Christian and hold to an openness around sexuality. So they choose to leave Christianity because of it. Right? And some people choose to changed their views on sexuality because of it. There's a big struggle. But that's also true with issues of economics. It's true with how we organize ourselves. My friend Shane Claiborne likes to say, I think it's possible to be a capitalist and a Christian in the 21st century. It's just really, really hard, and I'm not sure I've met anyone yet. But it's probably possible, would be his argument, right? And he's poking at something that our economic system that a lot of us buy into might make it really hard to sort of maintain a kind of Christian way of being in the world that would be legitimate. So these are really deep questions, and I deal with them all the time. I mean, I'm on a side of being public about Christianity that says the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike, and the mercy of God doesn't distinguish between either of them. And then people say like, oh, are you a universalist? And I said, well, I think that's a phrase people use for that. It's not the phrase I choose to use. I just like to say the rain falls on the just and the unjust alike, and God doesn't care. But we love our categories. I don't believe in the construct that structures a higher heaven and a middle earth and a lower hell, and that people who achieve sort of greatness go to the higher level and some of us get stuck in the middle and some of us go to lower places. So I don't hold to that. I don't think any of that has to do with Christianity. I think all of that has to do with some kind of social constructs that we put together. So I'm very theologically interested and engaged on a whole set of issues that people have thought were theological demands because they've been told that they were. So when I'm around my atheist friends and humanist friends, and I do lots of public conversations with these people, they'll say, you know, Doug, you and your crowd, the problem with all of you is you're not talking about Christianity. The things you guys are talking about that kind of make you in conversation with humanists and social good and all that, like, that's not Christianity that anybody recognizes. Christianity has rules, it has dogmas, it has exclusions, and that's what we mean. So you're not in that category. So they won't let me sort of get the out like, hey, not all Christians are like that. They're like, well, yes, they are, you're just not one. And then some people who are in Christianity say the same thing, like, hey, get out of here, stop claiming our name. If you don't believe me, watch the YouTube comments on this video when it gets posted, right? People will say very clearly, you are not in. So that's a dynamic in American exchange, in American interaction that really matters, I think, that not only how one lives, so I talked a lot about orthodoxy, and I'm sure we'll talk about the practice side of things. Is there a right practice? Orthopraxy, so ortho means correct, like orthodoxy. So a correct way of thinking, a correct way of believing, a correct way of living. I'm not orthodox, orthopraxic, or I don't think there's a right way. I think there's a calling of God for people to grow in maturity and in what in biblical tradition some people would call the fullness of Christ. And that's not ortho, that is graceful. So I come from that kind of a tradition that is really squishy, really, really hard to pin down. And for some people, they would find a very Jesus-y kind of flow to that hard to pin down thing. And some people, they're like, oh, just answer the question, right? Just say, so I guess the answer to the question is everyone's in, no one's out in God's view. And I think as a progressive evangelical, what we're trying to do is catch up to that opinion in our own social lives and our own social structures.
Squishy. Okay, let me think about that for a second, because when I consider my own Asian American background, squishy is probably not one of those ways of being that I think about very much, because conformity to familial expectations or even social in-group expectations can lead to a kind of orthodoxy, and orthopraxy looks different because of the mold that kind of can frequently exist for people from Asian American backgrounds. And you know, just to have you talk to each other a little bit, correct me if I'm wrong, Suzii, I was listening to some of your stuff earlier. You're talking about mentoring young people and the importance of making sure that you're very clear sometimes about some of the things that are Baptist distinctives. So that doesn't strike me as squishy. And I want to come back around to you, Doug. Where is the place for whatever clarity we can bring to, whether it's doctrinal positions or whatever, ethical issues? What is that space in between clarity and squishiness, if that's even a fair spectrum to set up. And you can please correct me if I'm not getting that right. So.
A couple things come to mind. One, I think in the work of Greg Jones, he talks about a concept called tradition innovation. And by the way, I love your title of your group of Innovative Space in Asian American Christianity, because I think this idea of innovation, I mean, just Trinitarianly, let's just start there. With God as creator, the idea of a pilgrim church. The church has been on mission, and one of the great gifts of my life has been to be in different cultures and different places around the world and experience Christian worship, Christian witness, Christian mission in so many different contexts and communities. So this idea that there is a traditioned innovation, that there are formative constructs out of every culture. So you mentioned your own formative constructs, and we've talked about formative constructs from evangelicalism, but we also look back to the Catholic worker movement. We look back to the human rights, bringing human rights petitions to the United Nations by Glenn Stassen, one of our own Baptist heroes. There's a lot of traditions that have seeds for innovation at the right time. And they come to fruition. I think one of the great metaphors of Scripture, and particularly Jesus' teaching, it's always about growing something in vineyards and seeds and maturity and what needs to be burned away and what needs to be sprouting new. And so this idea of a pilgrim church on a journey, because of the call of God, in hearts and minds and lives, and being open, being fresh enough to honor our traditions in those formative places for us, especially the Scripture, especially with our experience of faith leaders and that incarnational way in which we've experienced faith. Who were the people just ahead of us that gave us a spark, or were the mentor that put their arm around us at just the right time, or redeemed us for a ministry call, or somebody who gave us mentoring? This is the way in which the Pilgrim Church moves. And so that aspect of growth and movement and the expectation of it, not to calcify the tradition past, but to continue to innovate on it based on the leadership of the Spirit and, frankly, with the accountability of the community. So, Doug was talking about his conversations. I think our serious conversations with the whole culture, not just our niche, but beyond ourselves, how beautiful that is and what we bring to that. So I think that this juxtaposition, but to see ourselves in ministry and Christian community with these metaphors of growth, with the metaphors of leaving things behind in a respectful way, but time to lay them down, And then what do we pick up? What do we nurture? What embers do you blow on? And what's right for you? And what's right for the person next to you? The fact that those two things are different is to be celebrated, not condemned.
So tradition to innovation, you're standing in between two things. It implies, the subtext is a movement forward in a way. And that gets us kind of to the progressive side of progressive evangelical, which Doug, you've called yourself. Are we getting this right? The way that you've described the squishiness of things, is that part of the movement from tradition to innovation? Or how do you see it?
Yeah, I do think it's part of it. I think, so I'm careful to acknowledge that I've been socialized and culturalized in the United States, from 1966 to 2018, with a certain lived experience. And so that's what I represent. And my lived experience is that. And it's been informed by conversations and by a complex family system and living in a world in which I've had access to being in contact with a lot of different kinds of people. But it's pretty shaped and formed by some dominant culture in the United States. And I tend to fit into what has been the most dominantly and highly rewarded parts of our cultural traditions. White, male, educated, tall, strikingly good looking. Brilliant.
Anyone want to debate that part? Yes, we can.
Humor. All sorts of things. So I'm in it. So someone like me then can easily say, hey, squishiness is a real possibility, right? Without universalizing that. So I believe that all human experiences and human culture are particular, and Christianity is meant to be a people movement religion.
Amen.
It's not a singular cultural movement. It's not based on a land, like a lot of other religions are. It's not rooted in a single ethnic group from its earliest days in its roots of Hebrew and early Israelite expressions as its core, all the way through the early days of Christianity until today. It is open source code, to borrow language of today, for every society and every culture to do with it what they want. So tradition is always in place. So my squishiness is a tradition. It's a way. It's a thing that people who have access to a lot of movement and flow and structure would talk about. That's equally as valid of a Christian perspective, I would argue, as is someone who says, oh no, I come from a particular religious tradition that's built around some cultural assumptions, and it's going to have some rules and boundaries to it. I think both of those are legitimate. So I'm not trying to suggest that, well, only the open, free, progressive squishiness thing is true, and these others are false, which is one of the things that tends to happen in the traditional or versus progressive argument, right? The problem with the word progress is that it tends to mean better than it was. That's how we tend to, that's how we tend to, I mean, that's the feeling you get from it, right? It might not be the definition of the word. If you look at it, you know, to conserve versus to progress, or to regress, there's something going on with that language. So I would call myself a progressive, not only in the sense of like future versus past, which some people use language, but in the sense that, well, I come from a space in which we want deep innovations to definitely be a part of because our tradition, my tradition that I'm in, has sort of depleted the soil, to borrow a farming metaphor, and something's not going to grow here now. So we now need to find some other soil and let this soil rest so that something new can grow. So it's a kind of progress that says, I think we need to pilgrim, or we need to move, or we need to go somewhere else, cognitively, emotionally, theologically, in order to find freedom. And I think that's a valid expression of Christianity. So part of what makes it squishy for someone, it sounds squishy for when people hear me say what I'm saying, is that I'm not in contrast to tradition. I think that's a valid way of being Christian as well. I think there are valid ways of being Christian. That's the thing about Christianity, is that if it doesn't make a singular demand, then it also doesn't have a singular preference. And I believe in and hold to a God that is always on our side and doesn't have a contrary to that. There's no way for God not to be on our side. That God wants to work in all things for the good of all of them. So that's a theological and a practical and also a social location. That I don't know that progressive evangelical Christianity could exist everywhere in the world all times. It's not some universalizing truth that has been discovered and should be exported around the world. But there's a lot of limitations to what I'm saying. It has a real shadowy side. Everything has a shadowy side. And I would suggest every tradition does. And when people in those traditions start to say, I'm feeling more shadow than I am light here, they start to move and they start to play with it. And people who are deeply traditioned, they also recognize that in their traditions, people have been fussing with it all along. There's been a lot of little micro adjustments going on all the way through. So I'm not totally sure anymore that the tradition versus progress or the tradition versus contemporary question is as bounded or as binary as I've talked about it in the past.
Well, let's talk about social location for a minute. I'm the interfaith chaplain at a consortium of schools here in the area, and to locate myself socially can be difficult and can underserve the population that I'm trying to serve sometimes. And I can say, or I often do say, that I come from the evangelical world, but there's a hesitation there for me especially to own that. And I haven't heard you like say, I am an evangelical and carve out a space to defend, right? But I want to ask about the word, and I want to go at this issue more squarely. And I don't know where everyone's coming from. I would be very curious to know where everyone's coming from. The word fundamentalist used to be a good thing. The word born again used to be the way that people would self-describe themselves as Christians or identify. Evangelical came next. The word fundamentalist became a byword. The word born again has fallen to lack of use. And I think we've let them go. So what would be the big deal about letting evangelical go?
Oh, would that be a great thing? If, I don't mean to jump if you were to say something, but man, I would be all for it. I've tried for years even. I tried to even put a little post on there, like I'm post-evangelical the way that you're post-adolescent. I'm not against my adolescence, I'm just not one anymore. I've grown through it, and it was the starting point, but not my landing point, all of that. And I thought 15, 20 years ago that was the case. I thought evangelical was losing its social usability and would be gone. And then a lot of us wondered, well, what is the next set of language? And in light of there not being a next set of language, it has stayed. And it is calcified and been reinforced. Young's brilliant introduction said, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Dunn. Well, how do they know that? Apparently that's a social category that is used in public, that is used in space. I think those kinds of titles we have to acknowledge and recognize without allowing them, this is my own opinion, without allowing them to become personal identifiers. So it is true that demographically I'm a white, middle-aged male. I don't normally walk around with WMM as my identity. Hi, I'm Doug, white middle-aged male. That is a social explanation for how I experience the world that's useful and important and carries a lot of significance to it. But it's not a self-identifier. I don't think evangelicalism should have ever been a person's self-identifier. I think it's a sociological category to explain someone's religious placement. And as it turns out, that's not going away. I'll say to my conservative evangelical friends, they tend to use it as if it's theirs and that they are the keepers of it. But I would describe it as a sociological term, socio-religious term, not as a personal identity term. So there's a bit of an argument about who gets to call themselves an evangelical. I come from Minnesota, where Lutherans are the primary expression of Protestant religion. And the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the ELCA, they use it sort of as a title, but most Lutherans aren't like, I'm evangelical, even though they're the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. There's been a fight going on about who gets to own the term. So I'm trying to say, it's never been theological. It's not a theological term. It has been a sociological term, and people are trying to turn it into a theological term. I think they're trying to own, they're squatters who are trying to claim right to the land. And I think what some of us want to do is say to the squatters is, for sure you're welcome to be here. We all are welcome to be here, but it's just not your land. So don't act like this land of evangelicalism belongs to the conservatives alone, where you get to decide who's in and who's out.
And I want to hear from you in a second, Dr. Paynter. I think as someone who walks around having to define myself, right? So as an Asian American, that means something as I walk around with my features. As a male, that means something in my family. You know, these things I do have to, I'm accustomed to thinking about how I walk around with these identifiers, such that evangelicalism is just another important question to ask myself, like, am I walking around with this? Because the feeling of being a perpetual foreigner in this country has left many of us looking for a theological home, such that evangelical really is a theological issue. And so I'm going to give, I'm going to open it up in a minute for folks to talk about their experiences, to ask some questions about what we're hearing. But the difference in experience, I would really love to chase down in a minute. But I want to return to you, Dr. Paynter, about about this question that we're talking about that Doug has really been helpful about. So get your perspective.
Let me say this clearly. I think that for the category of evangelical has been used in media and pollsters and things like that. It's like, okay, we know who the main lines are. We know who the Catholics are. Okay, everybody else, fall into this category. But it is not a term. I mean, it's interesting to me. I had somebody ask me the other day, a reporter. Now, are the Cooperative Baptists part of the evangelical?
In a hushed tone, right?
Yeah, right. And so I don't know if I should. Am I offending you if I call you that? I mean, this was the whole conversation with this reporter, and a part of our, I would say, in some ways, our religious kind of illiteracy is an opportunity to really flesh out more accurate terminology. So I said we're a part of cooperative Christianity. That's not left, that's not right. It's just Christians that are open enough to cooperate with each other, to see the good in what you do, to appreciate this, and let's be a part of cooperative Christianity. So the sign that I have in my office, big as daylight on my bookshelf, is an ampersand. It's both and. And this whole idea of using religious categories to divide, to balkanize, to be pejorative, is really, that is not a part of my lexicon. And I think in creating terminology for my community to talk about the ampersand and cooperative Christianity is an ampersand endeavor. It's who are you joining with? And you think about, I put it this way, Jesus, when he says to the disciples, I'll make you fishers of men. What's he doing? He's looking at those nets. And a net, what is a net? It's just a bunch of string until it's knotted together. And then everywhere there's a knot, it's like a little ampersand. And, you're joined to somebody else and joined to somebody else. And pretty soon that net can hold a big catch of fish. But I see the term and the divisions of evangelicalism as a whole language construct that's been used to divide, to define, to minimize, to make negative. So this idea of both and Christianity, of both and ethics, of working towards things, understanding the greater experiences that are out there and how your traditions are different than mine. And wow, it's beautiful that it's both and can we knot ourselves together in this wider net that can hold the strength of the gospel? So, that's the image that I tend to take. And when I do think we need an effort in this country to educate the media about religious, the whole religious landscape and how it's experienced. And those of you that want to join me on a tour of major editorial boards and media outlets, let's go, because we have a great narrative to share. And we have left behind some, I think of the old Oliver Wendell Holmes poem about the chambered nautilus, the spiral shell. And that little creature moves a little bit, and there's a new, build thee more stately mansions, build thee a bigger house every time, something that has more capacity. So I think that we have a witness that we've been remiss in sharing that witness in the public space about the nature of our communities of faith and how they position themselves. Maybe we've not been creative enough in our lexicon to help communicate the truth of what we experience.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up in just a second. I'm going to ask one more question, and then this will conclude the first movement that, I'm thinking, talking about evangelicalism in general, but I'm hoping that the questions that come from you will launch us into a discussion about the distinctive Asian American experience of this question. But the question I have, I read a pointed article about the historical description or definition of evangelicalism. And I'm hearing you say that the house is getting bigger, inclusion, traditions have shadow sides, and so while tradition is important and everyone has one to really look into carefully, there's more. I'm hearing that very strongly. Rich Mao and Mark Labberton have written their kind of defense of the term, kind of saying, as long as evangelical means the following things, we're still going to use it. And then the pointed article that I read, I'll have to track down the source later, said people love to use Bevington's quadrilateral to describe historic evangelicalism. It's, it's biblicentrism, activism, Christocentrism, etc. But you don't get to do that anymore. 81% of so-called white evangelicals have done this. And then in the age of Roy Moore, this percentage of evangelicals have done this. You don't get to do that anymore. Can you comment for us on the project of trying to retain the term? Now, I'm hearing you saying there's more, but evangelical is also a tradition. Can you comment on trying to redefine and retain and all that is fraught with?
Yeah, I think it's been going on the entire time, right? The early days of what we call sort of the new evangelicalism from the late 1940s going forward, which has produced a number of seminaries, including Fuller Seminary, Christianity Today, guys like Billy Graham. They all came out of a particular movement, and they were arguing at the time in the late 40s and 50s that evangelicalism had to have the term neo in front of it. Neo-evangelicals. Big argument about that. Tried and tried and tried, and then it just sort of fell away. So people have been arguing about the term. The idea that some people at one seminary have tried to come up with a list of words that would allow them to still use evangelicalism, as if they get to make that decision if it's going to be used or not. It's great sort of tone to that. Or someone trying to put a broader theological definition, someone putting a social, that just tells us, okay, this has been going on the entire time. And I'm intrigued as a 51-year-old why this thing has had such sticking power for the last 70 years. Unbelievable. And the neo-evangelical came out of the late 19th century movement of evangelicals. There's something about it. Now, maybe it goes back to the root word of the good news, but it has in an American context, especially in a changing religious environment in an American context, it has become a Protestant catch-all for people who are passionate about life and faith. I mean, it's been the junk drawer of the kitchen, right? The knives are over here, the pots are over here, and then you have that drawer where you put all the other things. It's always sort of functioned as that catch-all idea. So I think someone trying to put too tight of a definition on it isn't so helpful. I find myself sort of in the camp of the people who wanted to call it neo-evangelical, saying, well, I'm a progressive evangelical. I think evangelicalism always needs a prefix to it. I think it's the only way that you're being honest about it, right? So I'm totally comfortable with someone saying, oh, I'm a pastor of a white church in a white culture in a white dominant society. I represent white evangelicalism. There's other expressions of evangelicalism that aren't rooted in that, and they can express what that experience is for an Asian evangelical experience, or for an African American evangelical experience, or an immigrant evangelical experience. I think those are all. It belongs to all of us, and this idea that there is one. It is the same tonality that tends to happen with Christianity writ large. So I think that's what it's pointing out. When the Roy Moores of the world, who I would say are fundamentalist evangelicals, and they should own that, and not get to say, well, we're just evangelicals and everybody else has to describe which kind you are. But that crowd should be welcomed to claim the name if they want it. It doesn't belong to anyone. I think the same thing about Christianity, though, right? Like, who gets to profess that somebody else is not Christian enough for them? So, but that's a particular tone, right? Coming from so I think the way you treat evangelical is the way you treat all of the faith that you say that you're a part of.
Thanks, Suzii.
A couple of things come to mind. Just keying off what Doug is saying. That I think back to the bigger context that we're in with, our historic roots of coming from countries existing in a world now where there are state religions. And one of the ways in which our great American experience has created this junk drawer is because we don't have state church. And so, you know, we have de facto state churches in certain states like Minnesota, Utah, whatever, Texas, Baptist. But, you know, I mean, we have de facto majoritarian faith bodies. And so this majoritarian idea that is part of our democracy also colors this understanding of evangelicalism, because how do we express, without having a state religion, all these divisions? Well, Catholicism, that has its clear boundaries. Mainline Protestant, that has its clear boundaries. But here we are in the miscellaneous junk drawer of religion. And so we're going to be in this kind of conflict with the majoritarian expressions of religion in different communities. And so that aspect of church and state, and that's why one of the reasons I'm very concerned about the separation of church and state in our country, part of some of the fundamentalist evangelical leanings right now, which is to blur those lines of church and state. Right? That's very, very dangerous. Because what we need to guard, I think, is our freedom to exist in a place where majoritarian religion does not become institutionalized as a legal or statutory norm because of the power of the way in which those majoritarian communities are located within different voting districts. So, you know, to me, one of the great aspects of our religious vitality as a country is the African American church in all its expressions. What if majoritarianism had ruled the day? What if evangelicalism had snuffed out the candle of great African American worship and expression, and given the patterns of Jim Crow and egregious limitations on the African American community? I think part of what we have to lift up are these absolutely beautiful expressions of faith that, okay, they may occupy the junk drawer with us, but we have to be great advocates for the maintenance of the freedom that we have. And so rather than trying to protect, redefine, whatever, just to say, here, there are bigger issues here that have to do with our basic freedoms and the fact that we have flourishing religious life in this country. As hard as it is to define, as difficult as it is to pin down, we have flourishing religious life because of these underpinnings. The first 16 words of the Bill of Rights. So we got some bigger things to pay attention to than.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you both. I want to open it up now for your questions and also your experiences.